The woman was both mother and sole guardian to 7 children, all born in the same small room, all sharing the same face. Their features were so alike it was as if they had been copied, not conceived. No man's name appeared on any birth record. Every branch of their family tree curled inward, binding blood to blood until no generation stood apart. Officials who saw them spoke of an unease they could not name, and within weeks the case was sealed. Within that time, their home was vanished from all records as if they never really existed there, and their names were erased from every public records. Yet traces of them survive, not in photographs or ledgers, but in the blood of a few who live there still. How can a family be erased, yet never truly gone? And who fathered 7 children that looked all the same? Before we go further, I want to ask you, where are you tuning in from right now? What time is it where you are? Share your location and the hour in the comments below. And while you are here with us, make sure you like this video and subscribe to X Archives so these stories, sealed, misfiled, and almost forgotten, can be told again. Because what you're about to hear is not a work of speculation, but a record hidden from the world. The entry for October of 1924 survives only in part, the paper browned at the edges, the ink softened by moisture. It concerns the arrival of a boy, estimated at no more than 9 years of age, brought in from the western edge of the county. He was described as unsteady on his feet, as though the ground were shifting beneath him. The nurse on duty, a woman who had served through 2 influenza seasons, later remarked that he had not walked so much as drifted. His steps small, deliberate, each footfall placed with care, as if he feared the floor itself might betray him. Behind him came 6 others, their ages uncertain. They moved as one, falling into an order that seemed neither practiced nor conscious, yet perfectly aligned. They were all pale-eyed, the same shade that the nurse likened to river ice. The similarity did not end there. The set of the jaw, the slope of the forehead, the faint, almost imperceptible downturn at the corners of the mouth, each detail mirrored from one to the next, so closely that the attending physician is said to have paused mid-examination, unable to decide whether he was seeing siblings or repetitions of the same face. They were quiet, not silent, for now and then one would draw a breath that sounded more like a suppressed whimper than a sigh, but they offered no questions, no protests. It was reported that the eldest, if indeed there was one, had whispered something inaudible when asked to step forward. The nurse believed it was not directed at her, but at the child beside him, who responded with a minute nod, almost imperceptible. The infirmary's west wing, where contagious cases were sometimes kept, had a narrow anteroom where the air felt stale no matter how often the windows were opened. It was here that the children were placed, each sitting in a wooden chair along the wall. The youngest, barely able to keep his head from lolling forward, was given the corner seat. The nurse wrote that she could not tell whether the child's eyes were closed from exhaustion or by choice. Over the next hour, routine examinations were attempted. Height, weight, reflexes. The measurements revealed little beyond a shared fragility, the bones fine, the joints loose, the muscles underdeveloped. Their skin bore the sallow undertone common in those deprived of varied diet, but there were no signs of active disease. The physician found this troubling in itself. Malnutrition without illness suggested a long, steady decline, not a sudden hardship. Later, it was noted that none of the children acted when the doctor's hands were cold or when the tongue depressor caused mild discomfort. Their stillness, their refusal to flinch, was remarked upon in a separate note written that same evening. "It is not stoicism," the nurse recorded in the margin. "It is absence. They are present, but not in the moment." The arrival had been reported to the county welfare office, and the attending physician was instructed to hold the children until an officer could be dispatched. As the day drew on, the ward grew quieter. The other patients, a few recovering from pneumonia, an elderly man with a chronic cough, began to whisper that the air felt heavier since the children had come. One patient claimed the hallway clock had run slow that afternoon, though the mechanism showed no fault. That night a storm passed over the county. The infirmary's roof groaned under the wind, and rain traced long, crooked lines down the tall windows of the west wing. A nurse making rounds before dawn found the children still seated as they had been placed the day before, their chairs unmoved. Only their eyes shifted, following her as she passed, each gaze holding for a moment before sliding to the next in unbroken succession, as though passing along a thought they could not speak aloud. By morning, one of the infirmary ledgers contained a final note under the entry: "All appear remarkably alike." No explanation followed, and no further description was attempted. The words seem almost reluctant, as if committing them to paper risked setting in motion something better left unnamed. The rest of the file is missing. Whether misplaced or deliberately removed, no one can say. Yet in later years, when the infirmary itself stood empty and the west wing smelled only of dust and plaster, there were still those in town who swore that, passing by in certain weather, they could hear the faint scuff of many small feet on wooden floors, moving not toward escape, but back into place. The nurse's written echo, "Unt," carried by hand to the welfare office, travelled along back roads slick from the last of the autumn rains. It was delivered not in an envelope, but folded flat, the creases pressed sharp by a careful hand. Those who later examined it remarked on the absence of excess language. It spoke in clipped precision of physical facts: height within a margin of an inch, hair of uniform ash grey, and an identical stiffness in the way each child carried their weight. The welfare clerk who first read it was not a nervous man by habit, but something in the description slowed his breath. He noted privately that such sameness would be remarkable even among twins, yet here it spanned children separated by what appeared to be a decade in age. His pencil hovered over the page before he set it down and locked the account in the drawer reserved for cases of discretion. A welfare officer was assigned within days. He was a man already tired before his work began, the sort whose years in service had reduced his optimism to habit rather than conviction. Colleagues recalled that he seldom met the eyes of those he interviewed, preferring to fix his gaze on some point beyond the subject. He was said to have read the nurse's account 3 times before rising from his desk and leaving the building without a word. The journey to the homestead took him past the edge of mapped county land. The path narrowed until the wheels of the wagon traced through wet leaves rather than soil, and the trees grew close enough that light fell in narrow, angled strips. He is believed to have paused before the final bend, listening for the sound of habitation, dogs, tools, voices, but hearing only the faint, irregular creak of wood in windless air. The house appeared abruptly, framed in the last of the afternoon light. It had the weary lean of a structure not quite abandoned, yet not tended either. The officer later described it, in words not intended for the file, as if it were waiting for something to arrive, though it had no notion what. The woman who opened the door stood thin and pale, the light from behind her flattening her features. At her sides, half-shadowed, the children arranged themselves in a loose cluster. The unnatural likeness described by the nurse was not diminished in daylight. Even the officer, accustomed to overlooking such matters, felt a momentary confusion, as though the faces before him were not separate at all, but variations of one image shifting subtly from one to the next. He observed the stiffness in their movement, the way knees and ankles bent with care, as if each joint might betray them if pressed too far. Their eyes were fixed on him, not with the guardedness of shyness, but with a steady, unblinking concentration. In later years, he could not recall whether they had blinked at all during his visit. The interior of the house bore no ornament, no books, no photographs, no items suggesting a life beyond necessity. The air smelled faintly of something scorched, though the stove was cold. The children sat in a row against one wall, knees drawn inward, their hands resting palm down on the tops of their thighs. They did not shift or speak. When he stepped outside, the officer noticed that the narrow path leading to the road seemed shorter than when he had walked it in, though he could not account for the change. He returned to the county office with his report, his tone measured, the details exact. But in the final line, he allowed one remark not strictly in keeping with procedure. The sameness is not merely in appearance, but in presence, as if they carry one mind between them. No one could later explain why the clerk who filed this report placed it in the bottom drawer beneath unrelated papers, or why it remained there for weeks before the board even took notice. But there is a small note in the office ledger, its ink smudged but still legible, that the officer who visited never took another assignment in that part of the county. The assignment had been delayed twice, first for weather, then for reasons left unspecified in the office ledger. By the time the welfare officer set out, late in November, the ground was hard beneath a thin crust of frost, and the air carried the brittle scent of leafless trees. The road westward narrowed gradually, the packed dirt giving way to stretches where roots rose through like knotted veins. A stand of black walnut trees marked the turnoff, so dense that sunlight reached the ground only in fractured shafts, pale and cool. From there the track dwindled to something less than a road, and soon even the ruts smoothed into the suggestion of a path no wider than a deer's passage. The officer's temperament was not given to curiosity. Colleagues described him as diligent but spare in words, never lingering over details that did not serve the task at hand. Yet on that day, he found his pace slowed without willing it, the sound of his own steps unnaturally loud in the air. More than once he paused, certain he had heard another tread matching his own. Each time he turned, the trees behind him stood exactly as before. The homestead appeared without warning, as though conjured from the dimness between the trunks. Its boards were weathered to the color of old bone, the shutters drawn tight. The chimney showed no trace of recent fire. Later, he would recall that it seemed not abandoned, but held in suspension, kept from collapse by some force other than care. He approached the porch and found the boards underfoot firm, but oddly yielding, as if softened from within. A single rocking chair leaned against the siding, its runners furred with moss. No sound came from inside, but he had the impression of being observed, not from a single point, but from several at once. The door opened slowly when he knocked, revealing the narrow figure of a woman in plain dress. Her posture was straight, though her shoulders did not seem to bear their own weight. The dim space behind her suggested motion, subtle shifts, the brief withdrawal of a face before it could be fully seen. Inside, the air was colder than it had been outdoors, heavy with a faint metallic tang. The walls were bare, the floors swept but uneven, as though boards had been lifted and replaced more than once. The officer took note of the absence of common signs of life. No tools at rest, no dishes, no fabric hung to dry. The only furniture in the main room was a bench along one wall. It was here that the children arranged themselves without instruction, 7 in total, each with the same pale ash hair, the same careful posture. He tried to place them in order of age, but the differences were elusive, measured more in the depth of lines at the corner of the eyes than in stature. None looked directly at one another, but their stillness seemed shared, as though held in place by the same thought. When he stepped nearer, their gazes turned toward him with the quiet precision of instruments aligned to a single axis. The officer made his inspection quickly, noting what he could without betraying discomfort. Before leaving, he glanced toward a narrow passage at the rear of the house. Its walls were bare, yet the air there felt warmer, as though it opened onto some hidden space beyond the plan of the building. The woman stood between him and the passage, her expression unchanged, but her stance subtly angled to block his view. Outside again, he found the light failing sooner than expected, the path to the walnut stand shorter than his memory allowed. By the time he reached the main road, the frost had thickened, and he could no longer be certain whether the tracks beside his own were those of an animal or if they had matched his stride all the way back. The woman who stood at the threshold gave no sign of greeting, nor of refusal. Her frame was thin to the point of austerity, yet her posture bore none of the fatigue her appearance might have suggested. The officer, later recalling her presence, noted only that her expression held neither welcome nor resistance, merely the steady regard of one who has measured the visitor before him and found no need to alter her stance. Behind her, in the dimness of the main room, 7 children held their positions as if bound by a single instruction. Their arrangement was not disorderly, yet it lacked the organic movement of a family at ease. The light that reached them from the open doorway caught the pale ash of their hair, and their faces, so uniform in structure, seemed to form a sequence, each a fraction's variation from the last. The absence of another adult was conspicuous, though no mention was made of it until much later in the report. No sound emerged from deeper within the house, no shifting of weight on loose floorboards, no clatter of work interrupted. The space beyond the children remained in a sort of shadow that seemed less a matter of poor lighting than a refusal of light to enter. The woman stepped back to admit the officer, the movement minimal, her eyes never leaving his. The children parted to either side without being addressed, each adopting a position against the wall, hands loosely clasped before them. Their stillness was not quite rigid, but it carried the suggestion of long practice. The officer was reminded, not fondly, of his time in the county school, when orphans from the poorhouse were brought in and told to sit quietly until the headmaster arrived. The air inside carried a faint dampness, as though the house's breath had been slowed for years. The boards beneath the officer's boots gave slightly, and he noticed a fine dust rising with each step, though no dust lay upon the children's shoulders or the hem of the mother's dress. Her eyes followed his gaze when it drifted toward a closed interior door at the far end of the room. The space between them seemed longer than the dimensions of the house could allow, and he found himself estimating the steps it would take to reach it. The woman's head inclined slightly, a motion that might have been a warning or nothing at all. When he asked, in the way officials do when gathering the necessary particulars about the children's schooling, the reply came without pause, though in words that would later be paraphrased as both not required and not possible. There was no bitterness in the tone, only a flat certainty, the kind that makes further inquiry feel intrusive. The officer began his routine observations, marking height, build, signs of recent illness. At close range, the resemblance between the children became almost disorienting, as though he were circling a single figure viewed from shifting angles. Only the smallest differences, a slight deviation in ear shape or the line of the brow, kept the illusion from being complete. He noted the absence of visible bruises or injuries, yet each child's stance betrayed a guardedness that did not spring from fear of the moment. It was the posture of those accustomed to being watched for errors that cannot be corrected. As he turned to leave, he became aware of a faint sound from behind the closed door. It was neither movement nor voice, but something between, a low, irregular cadence, like breath drawn too far and let out too slowly. The woman's gaze held him until he stepped past the threshold, back into the pale light of the day. Outside, the homestead seemed smaller, compressed under the stillness of the surrounding trees. The officer walked the path back without looking over his shoulder, though later he would be unable to say why he had the unshakable impression that the number of faces at the window did not match the number of children he had counted inside. The request for documentation was made full, family, though it carried the unspoken expectation that the matter would be straightforward. Birth records in the county were usually kept with care, ink laid in steady lines, names drawn out in the same deliberate hand across decades of entries. Yet when the packet arrived from the registrar's office, it contained no such certainties. The certificates, 7 in all, were arranged by year. Each bore the mother's name in the upper line, written in a script both neat and unadorned. The line reserved for the father's name was left blank, the space itself a quiet refusal. No marginal notes filled the void, no notations of absence or error. It was as though the omission had never been in need of explanation. The officer examined the documents in the dim light of the welfare office's record room. The ink was not faded. The omissions were not the product of neglect, but of intention. Each paper carried the same layout, the same deliberate spacing where the father's name should have been inscribed. The repetition began to feel less like clerical uniformity and more like a pattern with its own internal logic. He noted the places of birth, always the same township, always the same midwife listed as attending. The dates followed an uneven rhythm, sometimes a span of 2 years between entries, sometimes less than 12 months. He began to calculate the intervals, and with each completed sum, the sense of pattern grew more oppressive. When he inquired further, the town clerk offered no elaboration beyond the written record. The births, she explained without inflection, had all been duly registered and verified. No witnesses outside the midwife were ever listed, and no formal complaints had been lodged. Her tone suggested that the matter was as complete as it needed to be, and that further inquiry would yield nothing but silence. It was the midwife's ledger, acquired weeks later through all less official channels, that added an edge to the unease. The entries for the 7 children were terse, surname only, no father named, the ink laid down with the same even hand throughout. Yet in the margin beside each, there was a faint mark, not an initial or symbol of the trade, but a small, almost imperceptible cross. The officer could not say whether it was intended as ornament, warning, or simply a habit of the writer's pen. He found himself thinking of the mother as he had seen her, gaunt, watchful, her posture fixed between defiance and fatigue. If she had been asked about the missing names, he could imagine her replying in the same flat certainty she had shown when declining to speak of schooling. The absence, in her view, might not have been a deficiency at all, but a completeness unto itself. It was during this stage of the investigation that the officer began to experience a subtle but persistent sensation of duplication. In the course of his work, faces blurred together, as if the memory of one child's profile bled into another's. At times, reviewing the papers alone in the record room, he would feel certain that he had already turned a page, only to find his hand resting on the same document as before. He submitted his findings without speculation, noting only that the absence of paternal records was consistent and unexplained. The report was placed in the office archive, where it would remain untouched for years. Yet in the weeks following, the officer came to avoid the western edge of the county altogether. He would later explain, though only to one confidant, that while walking home one evening, he had glimpsed a figure standing at the corner near his own house. It was a boy, hair the color of ash, who turned to look at him with a face he recognized from the records. When the officer stepped forward, the boy was gone, but in the moment before he vanished, there had been something in his gaze, an unblinking familiarity, as if he knew not only the officer's name, but the blank spaces beside it. The township's midwife register was kept in a narrow, cloth-bound book, its spine warped from years of handling. The pages bore the yellowed hue of paper long exposed to lamplight, and the ink, though faded, had not surrendered its clarity. The officer came to it expecting a simple confirmation of dates and names. What he found instead was a rhythm, a mechanical precision in the entries that, after the first few pages, began to feel unnatural. Each of the 7 births was recorded in the same hand. The script was functional, without ornament, the lines drawn in a steady, almost unvarying tilt. For every entry, the initials of the mother were noted in the column allotted, the year and month placed beside them with the same unbroken care. But there was a further column, one that did not appear in all other entries of the book. In this space, under the heading for witnesses, was written the same name each time. It was not the name of a neighbor, nor the township doctor, nor any common attendant. It was the mother's own brother. The repetition was absolute. Over the span of years these births occupied, nothing else changed. Not the position of the handwriting on the page, not the precise order of the marks. It was as though the same scene had been transcribed again and again, only the dates shifting with the passing seasons. Inquiries into the brother yielded little. He appeared in no other township record beyond the census of a decade earlier, where he was listed as residing in the same household as the mother. After that, he vanished from tax rolls, voter registries, and church attendance logs. There was no record of marriage, employment, or departure. It was as if his existence had been reduced to a presence in that ledger alone. The midwife herself had not been seen for years. Those who remembered her spoke of a woman of unshakable discretion who could sit for hours without speaking unless spoken to. She was said to have lived in a narrow house near the Mill Road, and it was there the officer travelled, finding the place long since abandoned. The windows were shuttered, but a gap in the siding revealed a darkness inside that felt denser than mere absence of light. One neighbour, reluctant to speak, mentioned that in her final years the midwife was rarely seen in daylight. She was observed instead at dusk, walking alone toward the walnut grove at the edge of the township. Always at the same hour, and always returning after the lamps in the houses had been extinguished. No one had asked her destination. The officer returned to the ledger, hoping repeated study might yield some overlooked detail, yet each reading only deepened the disquiet. He began to notice faint indentations in the margins beside the brother's name, as if a fingernail had rested there a moment too long before the pen resumed its work. The marks were not deliberate enough to be symbols, yet they recurred with every entry. In the weeks that followed, he found himself waking in the early hours with the image of that column in his mind, the steady repeating letters that seemed to resist the passing of time. Once, during a late review, he thought he detected a faint difference in the ink of the last entry, as though it had been written later, perhaps even years after the date recorded. But when he turned back to compare it with the others, the distinction was gone, leaving him unsure whether it had ever existed. The ledger was eventually returned to its place in the township archive. No formal action was taken on the matter of the witness. Yet the officer kept a copy of those 7 entries for reasons he could not clearly explain. He would later admit in a half-voiced remark to a clerk that he sometimes thought of the brother, not as absent from the county, but as present in ways the record books could not name. And on cold nights, when the wind moved through the walnut trees in long, low currents, he said it felt as though the sound was not carried by the branches, but by a voice repeating the same name, again and again without end. The census pages for 1910 and 1920 were retrieved from the county archive, their edges frayed from decades of handling. The handwriting on the enumerator's forms was tidy but without flourish, each line laid down with the quiet authority of official record. At first glance, the information was unremarkable, columns of names, ages, occupations. But read from left to right and then back again, the repetition began to take shape. The mother's parents appeared on the 1910 sheet as first cousins, occupying a modest home near the Walnut Grove's southern edge. Their marriage had not been unusual for the area, at least not in the eyes of the time, but its consequence became clearer with each turn of the page. Neighboring households bore the same pair of surnames, inverting or combining them until the distinctions between maiden and married names blurred entirely. By 1920, the network had tightened. Several of the families listed in the earlier census no longer appeared at all, replaced by others whose members, though listed as separate households, repeated the same forenames and ages with uncanny precision. It was as if the population of the ridge had shifted in place, reassembling itself without changing its substance. The land boundaries noted in the enumerator's margins formed a patchwork in which bloodlines were stitched as tightly as fence rails. The officer tracing these connections began to notice that many of the children recorded on one property in 1910 appeared as part of another household 10 years later. The averages advanced exactly as expected. Yet the names of their parents shifted, sometimes by only a single letter, as though the census taker had misheard and written what was nearest to his understanding. In some cases, the same man or woman seemed to appear twice on a single sheet, once as a spouse, once as a sibling, distinguished only by the household number assigned in the far left column. The deeper the officer worked into these records, the more the lines between identity and repetition dissolved. It became possible to follow a single surname through 3 or 4 contiguous households, the given names changing, but the birth years arranged in a near-perfect mirror of the previous dwelling. In a few rare instances, 2 children in adjoining homes were recorded with the same year, month, and even day of birth, yet listed as cousins rather than siblings. When he brought these findings to the county clerk, the explanation was brisk. Rural enumerations were often inconsistent, especially where families intermarried. But the officer could not ignore the sensation that what he was seeing was not inconsistency, but a kind of deliberate obscurity, a rearrangement of names and ties so precise it could not be accidental. He marked one household in particular. In 1920, it contained the mother of the present case, her age recorded as 26, with 3 young children listed under her surname. Directly beneath, in the next household, lived her uncle, though his age suggested he could just as easily have been her father. Between these 2 homes, the census recorded 5 additional children, none with a listed father, all with surnames that alternated between the 2 households' names. There were no notes in the enumerator's comments to suggest illness, poverty, or itinerancy. The families were described as settled, their properties stable, their occupations consistent across the decade. And yet the boundaries between them were porous in ways that the record did not, and perhaps could not, fully contain. Late one evening, reviewing the census pages under lamplight, the officer noticed something that unsettled him more than the names themselves. In the 1920 sheet, the numbering of the households broke its natural sequence when it reached the ridge. For a span of 7 dwellings, the numbers skipped and doubled, as though the order of the visits had been disturbed. It was not an error the officer had seen before, and it did not reappear on any other page of that year's count. He closed the ledger and sat in the dim room until the lamp began to flicker, his mind tracing the invisible lines that bound those households together. Years later, when asked if he had ever considered revisiting the ridge, he would admit that he had not. In his words, there were places where the names on paper did not match the living faces, and it was better not to learn which of the 2 was lying. The genealogy charts began as a simple attempt at clarification, a way to align names, dates, and relationships into an orderly structure. But the further the officer worked, the more the lines between branches collapsed in on themselves. The tree that should have spread outward in time instead curved inward, coiling into patterns that suggested no true separation between limbs. Starting with the mother's entry, the first connections were unremarkable. Parents who were first cousins, grandparents linked by 2 shared surnames. Yet as the chart expanded, the distinctions between uncles, brothers, fathers, and cousins dissolved. The same man could be listed as an uncle in one document and as a father in another, with dates that supported both claims. In some cases, 2 different men, themselves related, were equally possible candidates for the same child's paternity. The officer noted how these overlaps were not confins, led to a single generation. Sons grew to occupy the same households as their mother's siblings. Daughters married within their own surname, and the resulting unions yielded children whose place in the family could be described in multiple, equally correct ways. Birth records, where they existed, did little to resolve the matter. The absence of paternal names, so consistent across the documents, meant that speculation could only narrow the possibilities, never confirm them. What troubled the officer more was the repetition of forenames. Across 3 generations, the same 5 given names recurred, applied to uncles, nephews, and cousins alike. This created an effect in which the same name might refer to 3 living men of different ages, any of whom could be the father of a child born in the same year. Tracing one branch, he found himself looping back to the starting point without realizing it, reading the same names in a different order, but arriving at the same conclusion, that all paths led to blood already shared. He consulted the church baptism records for clarity, hoping the naming of godparents might reveal outside connections. Instead, the sponsors listed were nearly always other members of the same 2 surnames. Even when an outsider appeared, it was often as a spouse brought in from a nearby hamlet, someone who, upon further review, proved to share a grandparent or great-grandparent with the family into which they had married. The final diagram filled an entire sheet of paper, yet resembled less a tree than a knot, a tightening of lines until they were nearly indistinguishable from one another. The officer's handwriting grew smaller toward the center, where the mother's name sat surrounded by dates, initials, and arrows pointing in conflicting directions. Here, the possible fathers for her 7 children formed a closed circle of blood relations, brothers, uncles, and men who were both dipe, ending on which thread one followed. It was during this stage of the work that the officer began to experience a peculiar unease, a sense that the family's history was less a record of events than a pattern repeating itself through different bodies. The reappearance of certain birth months across decades suggested an almost ritual rhythm to conception and birth, though the thought was dismissed as conjecture unfit for the report. Late one evening, while reviewing the chart alone, he thought he saw the ink of certain lines darken slightly, as though they had been traced over by another hand. When he ran his finger across the page, the surface felt raised, the paper subtly warped under the pressure of what seemed like recent work. Yet no one else had access to the room where the chart was kept. The diagram was eventually rolled and placed in the archive alongside the other case materials. In later years, when the officer spoke of it at all, he referred to it not as a family tree, but as a map of a place you cannot leave. He never clarified whether he meant the ridge itself or the blood that had folded in on itself there for as long as anyone could remember. The meeting was held in the State House, in a high-ceilinged chamber whose windows were kept closed against the winter wind. The walls, paneled in dark wood, seemed to lean inward as the members of the health board took their places along the long table. The matter had been entered on the agenda under a discreet heading, Special Circumstances, and no effort was made to speak of it before the doors were closed. The file lay at the center of the table, its contents stacked in rigid order: the infirmary notes, the welfare officer's report, the genealogical diagram. The members read in silence, some pausing over certain details longer than others, but none lingering on the photographs, which had been clipped together at the back. The description of the children was already known to them. To see their likeness repeated so precisely across the images seemed, to more than one present, a thing better left in written form. When discussion began, it was measured and low. The concern was not framed in the language of medicine or morality, but in the language of public order. If the matter were made known beyond the board, it was said, the result could be more damaging than the condition itself. Confidence in rural oversight, already frayed by recent scandals, might not survive the suggestion that such a family had been allowed to exist without intervention. The phrase, containment of knowledge appeared more than once, though no one remarked on its choice of words. One member, older than the rest, his voice worn thin from years of hearings, spoke of an earlier case, a family in the northern hills whose circumstances bore certain similarities. That file, too, had been sealed, and the township where it had originated now appeared in no official correspondence. The implication was clear. There were precedents for what they were about to do. Still, a few voices argued for quiet intervention. Removal of the children, separation into foster placements, the gradual dissolving of the family's presence on the ridge. But the sheriff's letter, included in the file, was read aloud, a warning of armed resistance from the mother's male relatives and the promise that any intrusion would be met as an act of aggression, not of law. The sheriff, a man not given to overstatement, had underlined that sentence. The discussion turned from action to inaction. If the family could not be dispersed without violence, perhaps the violence could be avoided altogether by allowing them to remain. The condition could be studied discreetly, the patterns observed over time. There was talk of assigning a single physician to monitor births in the area, though without recording them under the family's name. No formal vote was taken. Instead, the chair summed the consensus in a single sentence. The file would be classified for internal reference only, its details not to be entered in any public record. The papers were gathered, placed in a plain envelope, and handed to the clerk with the instruction that they be stored in the restricted archive. Those who left the meeting spoke little to one another, each descending the marble steps alone. The corridor outside the chamber seemed longer than it had when they had entered, and more than one member later remarked on the faint sensation, impossible to account for, that the air had grown heavier toward the far end. In the weeks that followed, the file's number was removed from the open index. No further reports were requested from the welfare officer. The family remained on the ridge, unseen by most, their existence known only to those who had sat at that table. Years later, when the chamber was renovated and the paneling replaced, a worker pulling down the old boards found a slip of paper pressed between the wall and the frame. It bore no date, no signature, only 7 names written in the same hand, each one crossed through with a single line, as though struck from a ledger that no longer existed. The letter arrived folded into thirds, the paper thick and faintly gritty from the dust of the road. It was written in a steady, deliberate hand, each word measured as if the writer had weighed not only its meaning, but its consequence. The sheriff addressed the board directly, stating that he had considered their intentions toward the family on the ridge and found them unwise. Any attempt to remove the children, he warned, would be met with armed resistance from the male relatives. The phrasing was not speculative. He wrote as one who had already seen the men gatted. Herod, silent, unsmiling, and armed, not in the manner of a town posse, but with the settled stillness of those who had long ago decided how they would meet intrusion. The sheriff described them not as unpredictable, but as resolute. They would, he believed, act without hesitation, and without speaking a word before the act was done. He advised silence over confrontation, stating that the family's way of life was both self-contained and self-defended. The ridge itself, he implied, acted as a barrier as much as the people who inhabited it. Roads narrowed to nothing before reaching the homestead. Paths forked without signs. Even in daylight, the place seemed to exist slightly apart from the county it legally belonged to. Though the letter was restrained, there was one passage that drew the board's attention. The sheriff wrote that he had once attempted to serve a warrant in that part of the ridge, unrelated to the present case. Upon his approach, he found the lane deserted, the houses shuttered, the smoke from chimneys faint but steady. And yet, from the tree line, he had felt the press of unseen eyes. The sense of being measured, counted perhaps, had been so keen that he withdrew without completing his task. He added that the male kin were not young men, but neither were they frail. Their strength was of the kind that comes from a lifetime of work and an absence of injury. They moved slowly, deliberately, but could close distance with disquieting speed when required. No one, he noted, had ever seen them argue. If they spoke among themselves, it was in tones too low for outsiders to overhear, even when standing close. The sheriff's own manner had altered in the weeks following his visit to the ridge. Those who knew him said he became slower to issue orders, more reluctant to send his deputies into unfamiliar corners of the county. When pressed, he would answer only that there were places in which the law existed in name, but not in practice. and that in those places the price of forcing the matter would not be worth the proof of author. IT. The letter concluded without flourish. He did not recommend that the board abandon the case entirely, only that any approach be indirect, without threat, without summons. But it was the final sentence, set slightly apart from the rest, that held the longest in the minds of those who read it. In it, the sheriff wrote, "If you go, they will be waiting before you are within sight of the house, and you will not see them until it is too late to turn back." When the letter was folded and returned to its envelope, no one in the room spoke for a long moment. The chairman eventually placed it beneath the other papers in the file, his hand lingering over the cover as though to hold the warning in place. The sheriff continued in his post for several more years, but he never again went into the ridge alone. And on certain cold mornings, when frost clung to the black walnut branches, he was said to pause in the street before unlocking his office door, looking toward the west as if counting a number only he knew, and waiting until it felt safe to begin the day. The vote was taken without ceremony. One by one, the members of the board raised their hands, their movements deliberate, their expressions unreadable. There was no dissent, no hesitation. The chairman, who had scarcely spoken during the meeting, recorded the decision in his own hand. The file was to be classified and sealed for internal reference only. The papers were gathered with care. Each sheet was squared against the others, the edges aligned, as though the neatness of the stack might bind its contents as tightly as the lock that would soon enclose them. The carbon copy, faint but legible, was placed in a separate folder, its cover marked in small block letters. It was this copy, not the original, that would be sent to the locked archive, the one reserved for matters never intended to resurface. The clerk assigned to carry it. There was a young man, not long in the post. He had handled restricted material before, but something in the way the folder seemed to hold its weight unsettled him. It was not heavier than any other, yet his fingers felt the pressure of it, as though the contents had absorbed more than paper and ink. The archive itself lay beneath the east wing of the building, down a narrow stairwell whose walls bore the faint smell of damp stone. The corridor at the base was lit by a single fixture that hummed faintly, casting a light that left more shadow than it removed. At its far end stood a steel cabinet, its surface cold to the touch, the key kept on a ring that the clerk had been told never to remove from his belt. He opened the cabinet slowly, the hinges giving a muted groan, and slid the folder into place between two other volumes whose spines bore no titles. As he did, he noticed a narrow gap at the back of the shelf, a recess in the stone wall that had not been there when he last visited. The darkness within was absolute. He leaned forward, not to look inside, but to listen. It was then, he thought, though he could not be certain, that he heard the faintest sound, like the rustle of many small movements, pausing the moment his breath reached the opening. The key turned stiffly in the lock. He replaced it on the ring and left without glancing back. When he reached the stairwell, he paused, feeling the cool air shift against the back of his neck. It was not a draught from the door above, but something slower, like breath drawn from a great distance. In the weeks that followed, the file was not requested, nor was it spoken of in the hallways. The members of the board attended to other matters, yet each of them, in unguarded moments, found their thoughts returning to the meeting, not to the decision itself, but to the peculiar stillness that had settled over the room when the vote was cast. It had been more than the quiet of formality. It had been the kind of silence that suggests something listening from beyond the walls. Years later, when the archive was inventoried during a change of administration, the steel cabinet was opened for the first time in decades. The folders were in their proper order, the carbon copies still in place. But the clerk who performed the count noted in the margin of his report that the paper, though untouched, felt faintly warm, as though it had been held between living hands only moments before. He did not remark on the other thing, the impression, brief but undeniable, that as he closed the cabinet, the gap at the back of the shelf had narrowed, and that whatever space had been there had drawn itself shut in silence. In the years that followed the sealing of the file, the road to the ridge changed in ways no one could name precisely, though all who travelled it agreed it was not as it had been. The black walnut trees thickened, their branches stretching until they crossed above the narrow track, dimming it even in summer. The ground beneath grew uneven, roots lifting through the soil in slow spirals, as if the forest itself meant to reclaim the way. The deer track beyond the grove narrowed to a faint seam in the undergrowth. By the second winter after the board's decision, even hunters who knew the ridge well admitted they could no longer find the homestead without taking wrong turns through the thickets. The officer who had once visited returned only once out of professional obligation, and reported that the path he remembered had split into two and then into three, none leading where they should. The county maps, when updated for property tax purposes, showed the land still held in the family's name. Yet the symbol marking the dwelling, the small square denoting a house, vanished from the next revision. No clerk could recall removing it, but the change went uncorrected, as though the absence matched some unspoken truth. Census enumerators, walking their routes in the 1930 count, Rassard, recorded only the neighboring farms. When asked later why they had not included the ridge, they gave inconsistent answers. Some claimed they had found the property abandoned. Others said the road itself had ended sooner than expected, and one admitted that he had turned back after walking for an hour without hearing a bird or seeing a clearing. None reported seeing the family, though none could say with certainty they had been gone. The sheriff, in his later years, told a deputy that he had once tried to reach the ridge again, out of curiosity more than duty. He described moving through the walnut grove and finding that the light behind him dimmed until it was indistinguishable from the shadow ahead. When he emerged from the trees, the ground rose in unfamiliar slopes, the air carrying no scent of wood smoke. He turned back without reaching the place where the homestead should have been, though he could not say why. Over time, the family's name appeared less often in county records. A birth here, a death there, always from illnesses that left no mark but the date of passing. School registers bore no trace of the children, and the church ledgers, when checked, contained entries for baptisms long past, but none in the present. The younger clerks who took over the offices had never seen the ridge for themselves, and spoke of it, if at all, as a place that no longer existed. By the time a new road survey was undertaken in the late 1940s, the land had folded into the general map of the county's woodland. No dwellings were marked, no footpaths drawn. The surveyors noted that the grove's density made it unsuitable for development, and the area was left without further notation. It was said, though never in writing, that in certain weather, usually after a week of unbroken rain, one could still find the old deer track. Those who did described a silence there unlike the rest of the forest, a stillness that seemed to extend inward for miles. On rare occasions, a hunter or traveler would speak of hearing faint sounds from deeper in the trees, the slow creak of boards under shifting weight, the muffled close of a door. No one ever followed the sounds to their source, and no one could say, when asked directly, whether the homestead had truly vanished or if it remained, waiting in a place the maps no longer knew how to reach. The welfare archives had been moved twice over the decades, each relocation leaving its own scars on the paper, creased corners, fading ink, the faint tide marks of water damage from some long-forgotten leak. The graduate researcher had not come looking for anything in particular. His project concerned rural welfare practices in the early part of the century, and his method was simple: work through the index from the beginning, noting any cases that had failed to close. Most were marked resolved or inactive, with the occasional withdrawn. But midway through the 1920s entries, he found a case number followed by a single word: classified. No date of closure, no note of transfer, no reference to any corresponding file. The index gave nothing else: no names, no location, only the number and that one word. He followed the reference into the bound ledger of the same year. The sequence of case numbers moved in steady increments, one per page, until the one he sought. Here the page was mostly blank. In the space where the description of circumstances should have been, there was a faint indentation in the paper, as though something had once been written there and later erased. Beneath it, in ink slightly darker than the rest, the word classified had been written in a smaller, tighter hand than the surrounding entries. The researcher requested the corresponding folder from the archive desk. The clerk, older than the rest of the staff, frowned at the number and left Whitworth. Hout speaking. She returned after several minutes to say the file could not be located. There was no record of it having been removed, but it was not in the cabinet where it should have been. He pressed further and was told the locked archive in the basement might hold older restricted cases. Permission was not ordinarily granted without departmental clearance, but the clerk eventually agreed to escort him down. The basement smelled faintly of mildew and something older, dust trapped in stone. The archive room was narrow, the shelves high, the light dim and uneven. The locked cabinet stood in the far corner. The clerk produced a key and opened it, revealing rows of unmarked folders, their spines numbered but without titles. They searched for the number together. The sequence ran without interruption until the place where it should have been. There, instead of a folder, was a gap precisely the width of one. The files on either side leaned slightly inward, as if they had been resting against something that was no longer there. The clerk said nothing, only closed the cabinet and locked it again. On the walk back up the stairs, the researcher asked how often files were found missing. The clerk replied that she had worked there for 30 years and no file had ever been misplaced from that cabinet. Her tone suggested that the absence was not the result of carelessness, but of something understood without being said. In the days following, the researcher combed through peripheral records, correspondence logs, internal memoranda, meeting minutes. The case number surfaced once more, in a list of special circumstances reviewed by the State Health Board. No detail accompanied it, but the line beneath it in the register had been crossed out with such force that the paper tore. He kept a note of the number in his own ledger, telling himself it was only for completeness. Yet he found himself returning to it often, as though it might shift if observed long enough. On his final visit to the archives, he opened the main index once more to the page where he had first seized. It. The number was still there, but the word beside it had changed. In the same careful hand where classified had been, there now stood 2 words, still active. The folder was kept apart from the others, resting in a narrow wooden tray lined with cloth to keep its edges from fraying further. When it was placed on the table, the smell of it arrived first. Damp paper, long dried, the faint metallic tang of rusted staples. Opening it was an act that required care. The typewritten pages inside had thinned almost to translucence, the fibers slackened by age and water. In several places, the ink had bled outward in pale halos, as though something unseen had pressed against the paper from beneath. A large bloom of water stain spread across the first page, its shape irregular, the edges feathered in shades of brown and grey. The earliest entries were intact enough to read. They described the initial contact with the family, the arrival of the children at the county infirmary, the officer's visit to the homestead. The language was formal, but between the lines there was a kind of restraint that spoke less of professionalism than of avoidance, as if the writer had been careful not to set down certain observations in plain terms. Then the gaps began. Whole sheets were missing, their absence marked only by faint impressions left on the remaining pages. In some cases, fragments of sentences survived at the bottom of a sheet, the top half torn clean away. These broken lines hinted at scenes more unsettling for their incompleteness, mention of movements in the rafters, unaccounted for voices, and a presence in the rear passage unapproached by staff. The surviving midsection of the file contained reports from different hands. The type varied slightly, some letters sharper, others faint at the edges, suggesting that the case had passed through multiple desks. Yet in each, the D's pies. Descriptions converged on the same points: the sameness of the children, the absence of paternal names, the hostility of the male relatives. And always, the tone was cautious, the sentences clipped short, as though the typist feared lingering over details. Toward the end, the ink grew lighter still, fading to the pale grey of ash. In this final portion, the type struck so softly into the paper that some words had to be read by tilting the page toward the light. Here, the narrative dissolved into fragments. Half a line about restricted entry to the West Wing, a note that the deputy declined further visits, and a remark, almost an afterthought, that the grove appears denser than last season. The last complete page was dated 2 months before the file's classification. It described an attempted follow-up visit by an unnamed party. The account ended mid-sentence, the final words reading, "Upon nearing the property, observed a figure at the edge of..." The paper ended there, clean cut, with no indication of what the figure stood at the edge of, or who had seen it. The remaining sheets after this were blank, their surfaces warped as if they had once been damp, but dried before ink could be applied. It was unclear whether they had been left for future entries that never came, or if something had been removed from them. The researcher handling the file closed it carefully, but not before noticing something on the inside of the back cover. In the lower corner, faint enough to miss at first glance, was a single fingerprint in dried ink. The ridgelines were sharp, but the pattern was odd, doubled, as though the same finger had pressed twice in the exact same place without shifting. When the folder was returned to its tray, the light in the archive room seemed to have dimmed slightly. No one remarked on it, and no one looked out the window to see if a cloud had passed. But later, when the researcher returned to his desk and reviewed the notes he had made from the file, he found a gap of nearly 20 minutes in his handwriting, a space where the pen had not moved, though he had no memory of pausing at all. The survey had not set out to find them. Its purpose was broader, an academic mapping of genetic diversity in remote rural populations, intended for publication in a journal whose readership cared more for statistical tables than the histories they concealed. But when the results came in, a pattern emerged in the outer columns of the data, a small cluster of households scattered across the ridge country carrying the same rare genetic markers. The markers themselves were not dangerous. They did not signal illness or confer any visible trait. Yet their rarity was striking, so much so that one of the research assistants remarked they might as well have been a signature. In the national database, the pattern appeared only here in this thinly populated stretch of land, and nowhere else. The team traced the participants backward through birth records, marriage licenses, and land deeds. What they found was a chain of incomplete information, surnames alternating in familiar sequence, fathers unnamed, addresses given only as Ridge or Beyond Grove. Census records from the last century showed the same properties occupied by different family groups whose members bore the same given names and overlapping ages, suggesting not replacement, but reordering. One of the lead researchers, working late in a borrowed office at the county building, followed the trail far enough to reach the sealed index. The case number was still there, the word beside it unaltered. He requested access, was told no such file existed, and was advised with polite finality to confine his study to the available data. Still, the numbers were insistent. On paper, the households were unrelated. In blood, they were tied more closely than even siblings might be. The analysis suggested that the shared markers were not tumors, relics of a distant common ancestor, but the result of repeated, deliberate closeness over generations. The probability models showed the cluster should have dispersed decades ago. It had not. During field visits, the researchers noted something not captured in their forms. The families in question lived far from one another in miles, yet when they spoke, briefly and never in detail, there was an undercurrent of familiarity. It was not warmth exactly, but an absence of distance, as if they had already measured and found one another known. The survey concluded without public mention of the anomaly, but the lead researcher kept a separate map in his private files. On it, the clustered households were marked with black pins. Over time, he began to notice changes. A family would move, yet the marker remained relevant, for the same pattern of blood appeared in the household that replaced them. The pins did not spread outward. They shifted within the same tight boundary, rearranging but never expanding. He visited the ridge once in late autumn. The road ended sooner than his map suggested, and from there he walked. The air was still, the walnut trees dark against the sky. Somewhere ahead, a dog barked once and fell silent. He did not find the homestead, though he was certain he had come close enough to hear, beneath the slow groan of the branches, the faint sound of many small feet on dry leaves moving in unison. When he returned to the county seat, he filed no report of the visit. The black pins on his map remained where they were, but he stopped updating the chart. In later years, when he was asked about the survey's anomalies, he would only say that some markers persisted because they had never intended to leave the place where they began, and though no official record named them as descendants, the numbers did not lie. They moved quietly between households, appearing and reappearing with the same inevitability as the turning of a season, leaving behind no trace but the blood that carried their echo forward, unseen and unbroken.